Hi folks, my name is Phil and welcome to Grounded, the series which looks at airlines of yesteryear. We're once again in Belgium as we take a look at the short-lived VG Airlines, later known as Delsey. Following the collapse of the Belgian flag carrier Sabena in November 2001, there was a bit of a mad scramble to fill the void left by the demise. Delta Air Transport, a regional airline affiliated with Sabena, stepped up to take the lion's share of the spoils, picking up the majority of Sabena's routes and aircraft. DAT soon rebranded as SN Brussels Airlines, having secured the image rights and IATA code of the fallen carrier. The low-fare airline Virgin Express expanded into new markets which it had previously been kept out of due to competition from the larger carrier. Both Virgin Express and the newly named SNBA quickly established a symbiotic relationship, with several routes operating under code-share agreements as both airlines adjusted to their new roles in the changed post-Sabena environment. As is the case in the animal kingdom, some scraps are left for the others, and in the case of the carcass of the fallen Sabena, there were two new airlines that came to pick at some of the few remaining pieces discarded by SNBA and Virgin. The first was VG Airlines, formed by Georges Gutelman, who, following his time at Trans-European Airways, Belgian Airlines, and his recently bankrupted Citybird, VG was to be his fourth airline adventure. VG would pick up the leases on a handful of ex-Sabena Airbus A330s and use them on routes to Africa on behalf of SN Brussels Airlines. It was a relatively safe business plan. SNBA would operate the aircraft themselves and were fully responsible for the ticket sales and, crucially, the financial risks. The second airline fighting for scraps was VG Airlines. Like VG Airlines, VG wanted to pick up some ex-Sabena aircraft, but instead of operating them in partnership with SNBA, would instead go it alone and forge their own destiny, which, as this is grounded, means you already know it isn't going to have a happy ending. VG Airlines would be headed by Freddie Van Gever, a man with a wealth of experience in the aviation industry. Van Gever helped establish Delta Air Transport, the very same one which went on to become SNBA. He also established the Flemish regional airline VLM, taking up the role of the carrier's first CEO. He was also instrumental in the growth of the cargo carrier European Air Transport, or EAT, having used his position of both CEO of the airline and consultant to DHL to first secure the carrier a lucrative contract, but then also organise the sale of EAT to DHL, cementing its place as one of Europe's largest cargo carriers. Van Gever would name his new airline after himself, using his last two initials to make VG Airlines. In November 2001, he was already in discussions with several investors regarding a financing package for his new venture. He had also applied to the Belgian authorities for an air operator certificate with the intention of launching operations early in the next year. He was also in discussion with Sabena's liquidators, having made an offer to take two ex-Sabena Airbus A340s if they were able to transfer Sabena's AOC along with them. The Belgian authorities refused to allow that ludicrous shortcut and thus the A340s went elsewhere, after sitting around for a few years waiting for new owners. Van Gever also tried to grease the wheels with the authorities by promising to exclusively hire former Sabena employees if VG Airlines became successful. Well, as long as he didn't hire Sabena's boardroom, VG might be okay. VG Airlines secured the leases to three Airbus A330-200 series aircraft. All three were ex-Sabena, and while they waited to enter service with VG, would undergo a cabin refit as well as a repaint into the striking VG Airlines livery. Designed by Dutch graphic design and illustration agency Lila Design, the livery was a very grey affair, with a dark grey upper fuselage and a pencil grey lower fuselage. Large VG Airlines billboard titles took centre stage, with the unusual addition of Van Gever & Co. NV titles. The tail design was simple, featuring a small Belgian flag stylised to morph into the VG Airlines swoosh feathered logo. The A330's huge winglets were also adorned with the Belgian tricolour to complete the look. The livery was very unique and would certainly stand out once the aircraft were allowed to stretch their wings and fly away from their Belgian base. On the 14th of February 2002, the first aircraft joined the VG Airlines fleet. It wouldn't be going anywhere yet though, as the airline was still waiting for its AOC. It would be another 2 months before the Belgian authorities granted VG Airlines an air operator's certificate, though even then, the airline still had more regulatory red tape to cut through, as the airline still needed US approval to operate its intended transatlantic routes. VG Airlines intended to operate flights from Brussels to New York, Boston and Los Angeles. The airline wanted to offer a high-quality service as the only Belgian airline to operate the route, going head-to-head with the US-based carriers and hoping that their higher standard of service would be enough to attract passengers. VG did also begin talks with travel agencies with regards to selling VG tickets, and also tour operators who may be interested in block booking seats on VG Airlines flights. Progress was slow, however, particularly in the United States, where due to a combination of lengthy negotiations and technical issues would lead to a delay of several months before VG flights would be added to US reservation systems. VG also reached an agreement with Armenian Airlines to operate through flights from Yerevan in Armenia to Los Angeles with the intention of serving the large Armenian American populations in New York, Boston and LA. The agreement would see Armenian Airlines bulk purchase 50% of seats on VG Airlines flights between Brussels and Yerevan, as well as cancel its own services to Amsterdam and Frankfurt in an effort at driving traffic into Brussels. It was the Armenian connection which drew concern from both European and American authorities. The EU authorities were concerned by VG Airlines planning to hire a number of Armenian crew, not so much them being Armenian, but instead being on different contracts and paid differently. The Americans, on the other hand, were concerned over potential security issues, both in Armenia and its neighbouring states. These concerns were quickly addressed and VG was given permission to operate its desired US routes. By May 2002, the VG Airlines fleet stood at 2 aircraft, both Airbus A330s, with the second one having arrived a few weeks earlier. This one will wear a different livery to its sister ship. Instead of VG Airlines titles, it had large Delsey titles, with a large red spot logo on the fuselage with smaller, operated by VG Airlines titles added further along the aircraft. This was more than just foreshadowing, however. It was to signify that the then owner of the Delsey luggage business, Tony Graham, had purchased a stake in the carrier. The lengthy startup process had left the airline running low on cash, and Tony Graham stepped in at the right moment to make an offer. May also saw VG Airlines take to the skies, in a manner of speaking, with the airline operating a number of flights on behalf of the Dutch charter carrier Air Holland. VG would also undertake a number of training flights, both for their own crew and those of fellow startup Birdie Airlines. One of these flights also served as a publicity flight with selected members of the press on board to get a taste of the VG Airlines experience. Rather oddly, however, the aircraft used on the PR flight was the one in Delsey livery rather than the standard VG Airlines one. On the 23rd of May 2002, the inaugural VG Airlines flight departed Brussels as a new chapter in Belgian aviation had begun. In the post-Sabena world there was a new long-haul airline, and that airline was VG. It was going to be a short chapter, of course, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. Things were looking up for the new airline. Flights to New York's JFK Airport had begun, and the Boston route was due to begin soon after. VG Airlines had finally gained approval from the US authorities to operate its desired route to Los Angeles, a 3 times per week service which would begin in Yerevan and transit through Brussels. The airline was also due to take delivery of another Airbus A330 during the first week of June, another ex-Sabena aircraft which would take their fleet to 3 aircraft. In a further effort to attract feeder traffic, VG Airlines entered an agreement with Belgium's second largest airline, Virgin Express, which would see the low-fare airline offering connections through Brussels. VG also entered an interline agreement with Air New Zealand offering onward connections to 7 Pacific destinations via Los Angeles. According to the airline, passenger numbers were already healthy and increasing, with load factors averaging around 50% and peaking at 75 to 80%, though those peaks were fairly sporadic and hardly the norm. In fact, the statement was quite misleading, as the airline was still having difficulties with the US reservation agencies, leading to almost empty flights heading back to Europe, with most of those passengers returning home on a round-trip ticket. Behind the scenes, VG Airlines was already in trouble. The airline was running out of cash, and fast. Starting up an airline is a costly affair. An airline has lots of expenses such as deposits to secure a fleet, the refurbishment and repainting of those aircraft, and of course the cost of hiring and training its employees. While VG Airlines did actually begin operations fairly quickly, less than a year from inception, the airline had planned on an earlier launch date, and with VG hitting regulatory red tape, this was pushed back and strung out their finances. Tony Graham had stepped in and made the airline an offer for a non-controlling stake in the company, and his cash injection had helped the airline get off the ground, and it looked like he was needed again. VG had in those very early days done a sensible thing and used its idle aircraft to operate charter flights for Air Holland. This should have been an excellent source of cash for the fledgling airline. Unfortunately, VG were very naive here. They hadn't done their due diligence and checked that Air Holland was actually able to pay them for the services, nor did they get their money up front. This was the third incarnation of Air Holland, having only recently been revived following its second demise, and the carrier was penniless. With Air Holland unable to pay VG Airlines for their services, it left VG even more out of pocket than had it just left its fleet sat idle. VG Airlines, Air Holland and Tony Graham all came to an agreement. Graham would buy the remaining shares in VG, giving himself complete control of the carrier, whilst also giving it a cash influx, and he would also acquire Air Holland in exchange for the monies owed. Despite common ownership, the two airlines were kept operationally separate, though they were now both taking money from the same proverbial pot. With VG Airlines under new ownership, it was decided to rebrand the airline as Delsey Airlines, with the airline stating that this brand is more easily marketed than VG Airlines in the USA. And to be fair, Delsey does make one think of their suitcases and travel. Although the airline would lose the VG name, its namesake, Freddie Vangever, would remain as the company chairman. The airline also announced its intention to acquire another 2 to 3 Airbus A330s as it looked at further expansion, with the airline expected to pick up the 3 remaining ex-Sabena A330s still stored in Germany. VG Airlines officially became Delsey Airlines on the 8th of August 2002. The 2 A330s that were in full VG Airlines livery were to remain as is until the quieter winter season approached, when they could nip into the hangar for a quick revinyl. This left the airline still facing a bit of an identity crisis, as 2 aircraft were branded as VG Airlines, while the third sported Delsey Airlines livery, complete with operated by VG Airlines titles. The newly rebranded Delsey Airlines reached an agreement with the Las Vegas-based National Airlines, which would see National offer connections onto their US domestic network from Los Angeles. This third incarnation of National operated a fleet of Boeing 757s from Las Vegas to 19 destinations across the USA and was covered way back in episode 17, so check out that episode for the full story on them. Delsey were also searching for a similar deal out of Boston, with the airline hoping to find an airline to partner with and help boost their dismal passenger figure out of what is affectionately known as Beantown. Delsey was now operating a daily flight to New York, a 5 days a week service to Boston, and a 3 times a week service from Yerevan to Los Angeles via Brussels. They were still struggling with passenger numbers, however, particularly on departures from the United States, where the airline continued to face difficulty getting connected with travel agent systems stateside. Despite the airline rebranding to a more marketable name, the airline didn't bother to do much, if any, marketing in the United States, which, let's not forget, half of their expected customer base lived. By September, Delsey's load factor was as low as 25%, with passenger numbers hitting an all-time low on September 11, 2002, when their flight from Brussels to New York had just 5 passengers on board. The airline did try to improve things, however, when it arranged a feeder service to begin from Frankfurt to Brussels. Delsey entered into an agreement with a new startup airline, Berlin Jet, not to be confused with Air Berlin, with Berlin Jet set to operate the feeder service for Delsey. Berlin Jet didn't have their own metal and were forced to charter an Embraer turboprop from a Spanish outfit. Berlin Jet were a lost cause. A few weeks after they penned their deal with Delsey, their inaugural service between Berlin and Frankfurt had just 6 fare-paying passengers turn up, who were outnumbered nearly 2 to 1 by the 20 journalists waiting at the gate. Berlin Jet was supposed to operate a 3 times a day service between Frankfurt and Brussels for Delsey, but in total the airline managed just 14 flights before their aircraft was impounded. Delsey did continue to try and make ends meet. The airline operated a number of sub-charter flights for MEA, with their A330 making a number of trips between Beirut and London Heathrow. The airline finally made progress with the US booking system, but it was too late. Delsey was losing a reported €124,000 a day and were forced to make cuts. The New York and Boston routes were axed in early October, with the airline intending on using the aircraft on more lucrative ad hoc work. The Los Angeles route was retained as Delsey's deal with Armenian Airlines to operate the route from Yerevan via Brussels still stood. It seemed though that Armenian Airlines were not very forthcoming with the cash, however, as the relationship between them and Delsey soured. The financial dispute went on for a fortnight and led to some lengthy delays on what was Delsey's sole remaining route. Although Delsey had settled the dispute, it was still desperately short on cash. Tony Graham's money pot was empty after both Delsey and Air Holland had drank it dry. Delsey had been seeking new financing, with the airline even in talks with an undisclosed Asian carrier over the sale of a 65% stake in the company. These efforts were too little too late, however. With the airline unable to pay its bills, Sabena Technics withdrew their technical support, and as a result, Delsey Airlines was forced to cease operations on the 23rd of October 2002 after just 5 months of flying. 2 weeks later, on the 5th of November 2002, the Belgian courts declared the airline bankrupt and liquidation proceedings could begin. Delsey Airlines was grounded permanently. So, what went wrong? As is usually the case, there were several factors which led to the airline's demise, though it could be argued that VG were almost certainly doomed from day one. Going right back to the beginning, it was clear that VG Airlines, as it was known then, was undercapitalised. It costs a considerable amount of money to start an airline. The initial expenditure is usually the main barrier for entry for most proposed airline startups. It's generally accepted that a new airline won't make a profit for up to its first 3 years of operation, and yet VG only lasted 5 months before going bankrupt. It seemed that VG's tactic to get around the lack of initial funding was to begin operations as soon as possible. Unfortunately, they hadn't planned for any delay to their launch date, so when the airline was hit with regulatory red tape, they were put in a weak position from the get-go. VG managed to get a lifeline from Tony Graham, with him providing the airline financing in exchange for a small stake in the carrier, with this being enough to keep the airline ticking over until it gained the regulatory approval. Having secured their air operator certificate and appropriate licenses from the Belgian authorities, the airline did the sensible thing and operated sub-charters for other carriers whilst awaiting its approval to start their own services. This would be an excellent source of revenue, especially for a carrier in the launch phase. Unfortunately though, VG were very naive. They didn't get their cash up front from Air Holland, nor did they check that the airline was even able to pay for services rendered. This was the third incarnation of Air Holland. The original and more reputable one had gone bust over a decade earlier. A second attempt at cashing in on their good name went bust in 1999, and in 2000 a third attempt took to the skies and immediately began struggling. VG's naivety could only be explained by them being extremely desperate for money and taking the first contract that came their way. It was the dealings with Air Holland which would ultimately lead to the demise of VG Airlines. Air Holland never paid VG for their services, leaving them out of pocket for the use of the aircraft, the crew, fuel and handling fees. Ultimately, Air Holland and VG Airlines agreed to a debt equity swap, which would see the two under common ownership, itself another bad idea, as now there were two airlines taking money from the same pot. VG had sought rescue from Tony Graham, the man who had already stepped in and offered a lifeline before the airline had even taken to the skies. This time, Graham acquired the job lot. Along with his investment came more ambition, with new routes and new aircraft on the cards. The thing was, expansion should have been pretty far down the to-do list given just how bad things were in general. Despite changing the airline's name from VG Airlines to Delsey Airlines in an attempt at using a more marketable name, the airline didn't really do any marketing whatsoever. This was particularly bad as the airline was almost completely unheard of in the United States, and as for European passengers, well, they seemed to prefer routing via the likes of London, Amsterdam or Paris with more well-known carriers. Considering that Delsey had an agreement with Virgin Express to feed traffic into Brussels, this speaks volumes regarding their lack of marketing appeal. The airline had also set up an agreement with National Airlines to offer connections through Los Angeles, and while National did serve 8 destinations from LAX, they all required transiting through Las Vegas. Even worse than that was all of these destinations were in the east, meaning folks would be flying right past their intended destination on the Delsey flight, then doubling back on a national flight. This was hardly an appealing position, even for a passenger on a very tight budget, meaning that the national deal wasn't really likely to draw in much custom, aside from those wishing to visit Sin City. Had Delsey been successful in finding a partner airline to operate connections from Boston, this may have turned out to have a happier ending. Delsey's lack of marketing, combined with issues slowing the airline from getting set up with US travel agencies, led to shockingly low load factors. Despite the airline saying they were averaging around 50% and peaking at around 75 to 80%, those figures were fudged somewhat, as they were for flights from Europe to the USA, with the flights inbound to Europe being considerably emptier. In the airline's final 2 months, it seemed that the average load factors were considerably lower, around 25% in fact, with one flight even having its passengers outnumbered by crew when a New York flight departed with just 5 passengers. With dismally low load factors, very few future bookings and empty aircraft flying around, by the end of September it was clear that Delsey's days were numbered. The last-ditch attempt at finding new financing came too late. Unless a buyer was dead set on a deal and putting money up front to keep the airline going, even the quickest of takeover talks would have outlasted what little life was left in the airline. The Air Holland farce continued to cause problems too. Eurocontrol, who are responsible for air traffic control services over most of Europe, came after the airline for €1.2 million in unpaid fees. The airline had been granted a 3-week reprieve by the courts to find new finance, and with their aircraft already impounded, it looked certain they were going to go down and take Delsey with them. The final nail in Delsey's coffin, however, was their deal with Armenian Airlines. First, VG's, as it was then, launch was delayed by concerns over both security and the staffing of flights by the proposed deal. Second was the falling out between the two parties in late September. Armenian Airlines and Delsey had a financial dispute which, instead of being dealt with in a timely manner, was allowed to affect the sole remaining Delsey route. With this route in turmoil, the airline was unable to secure more financing, either from a new investor, nor from extending their loan facility from the bank, and as such, the airline found itself insolvent and, well, grounded. Thanks for watching. If you have any comments, suggestions or criticisms, please do get in touch. If you don't have a YouTube doodah, don't worry, I've got a contact form on my website and I'm also on Facebook and Twitter. I have plenty more episodes in the works, so if you haven't already, why not subscribe to catch them as they land? And as always, thanks for watching.